The San Francisco 49ers balancing act in the 2025 offseason. Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch start to lay out the plan in their offseason press conference, trying to find a balance between transitioning and running it back. We'll talk about it. Defensive coordinator interviews as well on this edition of Locked On 49ers.
You are Locked On 49ers, your daily San Francisco 49ers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On 49ers. Brian Peacock and Eric Crocker with you. It's good to be back at BD Peacock, at Crocky209. Thanks, everybody, for making us your first listen on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Love and appreciate all the everydayers out there. We've got a lot to talk about here. We're going to start zoomed out and kind of zoom in a little bit closer and closer every single day as we head through the offseason and into the NFL draft and beyond. But talking about the everydayers, and welcome to all the new listeners as well, Croc. I do want to just shout out all the listeners. A huge thank you to everybody who's been reaching out to me. I haven't been on the pod for the last, week, 10 days, 2 weeks. I don't really know how long it's been. But my father passed away, so I've been away. And I know you mentioned it to the listeners, Croc, on the pod. And I really enjoyed listening to you talk about your father on an episode a couple of days ago. And so many people have reached out, and it means a lot to me, and I really appreciate all the love from everybody on the social media, close friends, or even people who listen to the podcast maybe just in passing every once in a while, people on the network and colleagues and stuff. And so I really appreciate a heartfelt thank you to all those people who reached out with kind words for me during this time. And it kind of blows me away, Croc, because we talk into a void sometimes, and you hear from there's always listeners that are hitting you up on Twitter, or that are always joining us, the everydayers in the live chat, and you know who they are, but we see the numbers. There's millions of listens and views to this podcast every year, and we don't hear from most of them. And sometimes you forget how many people you're reaching and how many people. And so at a time like this, hearing from so many more people than you usually do was pretty wild to me, because I forget how many people listen to this show. And, during those Spotify Wrapped end of year stuff, Croc, the people listened to Locked On 49ers from 63 countries around the world. I can't even name 63 countries. It's insane. And so to start hearing from some of these people,
I don't even know if I knew there was 63 countries.
I think there's a lot more than that, but I could not come up with 63, I don't think. But here's the 2025, Croc, my first episode of 2025, and let's make it 64 countries. Let's see if we can expand our global domination just one more country further. But a huge thank you to all the listeners out there. Most of all, Croc, a huge thank you to you for holding it down for me while I was gone.
Now we appreciate you. Just I appreciate you for sure. Not just being on the podcast and whatnot, but you've always been somebody that I always run by certain things that's going on in my personal life, and me knowing what it's like to kind of go through the situation that you went through, and I tried to touch on that in an episode, but I miss my dad every day. And I just know how hard that is. So, I text you, I said, dude, don't rush back, whether it's a week, a month, 2 months, however long that you need, take your time. But I am glad to have you back.
It was actually helpful to me just to because I didn't watch a lot of football. I watched a little bit. I got to see Juwan Jennings get kicked out. And it was actually that Sunday, my son had his very first football practice on the last day of the season, and flag football. And so I went with my son to that. I saw Juwan Jennings get kicked out of the game, and then left to football practice and watched my son run around on the field a little bit. So that was kind of fun to get back to some normal activities in my life a little bit. But that's the least of a 49ers game that I've seen in I don't know how long, decades probably. Certainly since the 8 years that I've been doing. I'm coming up on 8 years this month, by the way, doing Locked On 49ers. And
I'll tell you this real quick, Peacock. Like, not watching the entirety of that game, you didn't miss anything.
Judging by the final score, I didn't even feel like a strong pull to even go back and watch everything I missed. I think I might have seen the best fireworks in that game with Juwan Jennings getting kicked out. I thought it was hilarious. I was just dying laughing, to be honest with you, seeing him go back and start fighting again with the dudes on the second play right after that. Because I thought that was the end of it, the first play. Then he comes back after him the second time, and I was like, oh, this is hilarious. Him flopping over the top of him. Just phenomenal stuff from Juwan Jennings. So appreciate Juwan putting a smile on my face there on the last Sunday of the season. So, but it's a reminder, and I want to tell everybody out there, I started the show like we don't get to hear from everybody. There's so many people that listen to the show that we don't get to hear from. So like whether it's just you hit the thumbs up or you subscribe or say hi, come through the chat, through the YouTube comments or on Twitter, whatever social media it is, let us know that you're out there from time to time. We really appreciate it. So, and again, thank you so much to all the listeners out there, all the faithful listeners, the everydayers that listen to us every day. Some folks listen to us just once a week, sometimes once a month, maybe just a few times a year. And welcome to the first timers as well. We really appreciate that. Really appreciate you out there. And it meant a lot to me to hear all the love and hear from everybody and tons of support. I do want to say one more thing about my dad, and it's something that you had talked about in the podcast a couple of days ago. Then we'll get into a lot of this 49ers stuff here. And I've heard from a lot of people and a lot of listeners, and it's something that's like, it never goes away, and it's always there. And that's going to be tough, but it's good and bad because my father's going to stay with me like your father has stayed with you. And there's things that you learn that will never go away. So that's one of the biggest things I feel right now. And the comfort I feel is knowing that all the times we had together, for him to have battled cancer like he did, and to give me that last lesson of how to persevere. And he made it through Christmas Day, and he was present and he was there, and it was really an awesome Christmas. And then he just kind of went to sleep and faded away after that. And like he left it all out there for us to have that one last time. And all the way that my life has been shaped for him to allow me to bring my friends over and play loud rock and roll music in the house. Nobody else's parents were going to let us do that. But my dad let us do that. And if I didn't do that stuff, and if I wasn't playing around with audio back then, I wouldn't have ended up doing radio. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. I have my career because my dad let me, what seemed like probably just playing a bunch of loud music leading nowhere, led to a career for me. And then seeing what he's passed down genetically to my son, his grandson. And I see a lot of the traits from my dad in my son, and the sense of humor, which is so important. And some of the things my son does, I'm like, that's my dad right there. That's your grandfather in you. And so that's going to live on forever. And that's where I take comfort right now, because I know the feeling of missing my father's never going to go away. And that's what I hear from a lot of people at times like this. But knowing that he lives on through myself, through my son, through my family is really important. And so for that, I am thankful.
And I think a lot of people, they probably don't know, but anytime y'all saw, if you're watching on YouTube and you see Peacock recording somewhere else, more times than not, it was him visiting his father as he was, battling cancer, and you were taking trips back and forth to Visalia, but still making sure that you're available to get on the podcast. So, I think that was just cool for you to, be able to take those trips and do that and spend that time with him.
Yeah, a lot of away games this year. Hopefully a lot fewer away games this year. And if I am doing an away game, it's because I'm on vacation and doing something that's, a lot less heavy than what I've dealt with this year. And I'm ready to it's a transitional year for me and my family. And it's a transitional year for the San Francisco 49ers, Croc. So let's get into this huge offseason for the San Francisco 49ers. Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch press conference kind of laid out the plan, or laid out the fact that they don't have their plan yet, but gave us some hints to what their plan will be. Robert Saleh, Deshea Townsend, the first two interviews for defensive coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers as well. Next. This episode of Locked On 49ers brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of endless waiting, wondering, and worrying about your taxes? Well, now it's a thing of the past. You see, taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with the TurboTax expert who can get to work on your return right away. No more waiting for answers. No more wondering if you're missing out on deductions or any of the other million things that go through your mind when you're trying to fill out taxes. Whether you've got one form or 20, TurboTax experts give you their undivided attention while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on what really matters. You won't have to lift a finger, but you'll get the peace of mind knowing that your taxes can be handled by the pros. So if you're ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed, head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate so you can focus on your day. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees. It's playoff time. And if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of the football season, especially when your team is not in it. That's where PrizePicks comes in. If you love football, you want a chance to win real money while watching these games, PrizePicks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With PrizePicks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like passing yards, rushing touchdowns, and for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in as little as 60 seconds. And whether you're looking for a flex play or boost your payout, or you want to cash out quickly, PrizePicks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions in winnings, it's clear that people are loving this platform. So you might be eyeing Jared Goff this weekend for more than 230 passing yards. Or how about Saquon Barkley, who's been automatic this year, more than one touchdown? Here's a special offer as well for our Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's PrizePicks. Run your game. Download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks. Run your game. All right, Croc, I'm interested to hear what your biggest takeaways were from the Kyle Shanahan press conference before we get into the specifics of some defensive coordinators that have been interviewed by the San Francisco 49ers. And I think the big topics were obviously the coordinator spots, both, and they need two coordinators, right? And actually, all three. It's the trifecta of coordinators this offseason because they actually added a quote-unquote offensive coordinator in Clay Kubiak, who's clearly still not going to call the plays because Kyle Shanahan, I think, would rather be an offensive coordinator and call plays somewhere than be a head coach and not call plays. So people have talked about that potentially happening for Kyle. No, Kyle Shanahan's going to still call the plays. But Clay Kubiak is now, just like it was with it's kind of the progress that assistants make under Kyle Shanahan. They start to get a little heat from other teams, so he gives them a new title, passing game coordinator, run game coordinator, and then you got to go all the way up to offensive coordinator so we can try to keep them away from being poached by other teams. Major brain drain been going on throughout the years for the San Francisco 49ers. I get one of those guys back. But so all three coordinator positions are going to change this offseason. We already know who the offensive coordinator is going to be in name, but we do know that Kyle Shanahan is still the play caller and really the OC for the San Francisco 49ers. And now they're looking for a new defensive coordinator. And obviously after firing Nick Sorensen, they need a new DC, and firing Brian Schneider, they need a new special teams coordinator. But what's interesting is that Kyle Shanahan, I think, kind of wants to bring Nick Sorensen back and just transition him from defensive coordinator to special teams coordinator. You bring in a better defensive coordinator, Croc, and now you killed two birds with one stone. Does that sound too good to be true? Is that too easy of a plan just to kind of to double up there and move one guy over and strengthen both coaching positions at the same time?
No, I think that's the perfect thing to do, especially for Nick Sorensen, right? Like, that's something that he probably excels at. He does well at. I bet Nick Sorensen, after a year of being a defensive coordinator, and first, I wonder if that was their plan all along with the defensive coordinator position. Like, we talked about Jeff Ulbrich. He was somebody that they were interested in last year. Maybe there were a couple other people, and it's like, we have to settle for Nick Sorensen. All right, Sorensen, look, we'll bring you on as defensive coordinator. We'll try to teach you our ways. If it works out, great. If it doesn't, then, hey, man, you may be able to just go back to doing what you've been doing. So maybe Nick Sorensen was like, tried defensive coordinating, not my thing. I think it's the defensive line coach. He's like, I don't want to be a coordinator. There are some people that would rather be a position coach or maybe do something else like do special teams coordinating. So if Sorensen is someone that's going to help improve the 49ers special teams, which definitely was an issue throughout this season, the last couple of years, really, then, man, I'm all for it. And he can make that transition down and bring in a fresh face on defense or a face that we're actually familiar with.
I thought it was interesting that essentially Kyle Shanahan said that it was about who was available. He clearly, I think Steve Wilks and definitely Nick Sorensen weren't the number one names on Kyle Shanahan's list. He tried to go to the New York Jets and hire one of those guys as defensive, or not one of those guys, Jeff Ulbrich as defense coordinator, because obviously Robert Saleh is the head coach and he wasn't going anywhere. 5 weeks into the season, Robert Saleh gets fired. And it's like, Jets, what are you doing? Could you have figured this thing out 5 weeks sooner so the Niners could have just hired a different defensive coordinator? Maybe they wouldn't be looking for a new guy right now. But the fact that Ulbrich and Robert Saleh, Lou Anarumo, I think is a really big name. We know Deshea Townsend has been interviewed by the 49ers. It was interesting because Kyle basically said that there's some really good names out there and guys he would rather have as defensive coordinator than Nick Sorensen, guys he would have hired last year if they were available, and now they are available. So it was more about who's available this season. And my big question to you, Croc, about the 49ers and about their hire is, do you think they should go back to Saleh? Do you think they should stay in this, what we've called on this podcast, Kyle Shanahan scheme? I was asked by the host of Locked On Colts about Steve Wilks. And I was like, I don't know what Steve Wilks' scheme is because he didn't get to run it with the 49ers, right? They were running the Kyle Shanahan defense. They run the Kyle Shanahan offense and the Kyle Shanahan defense. Do the 49ers need to go completely outside, hire someone that's just going to run their scheme that's a different scheme than what the 49ers have been running for the last 8 years?
I would like that. Let somebody do their thing. I'm first-time head coach, and I've actually learned a lot about head coaching from Kyle Shanahan, things I like and things that is like I would do a little different. And when I hired a defensive coordinator, I have my thoughts and philosophies on how I would run my defense if I was doing the play calling. But when you hire someone, if you want them to be the best version of themselves, you have to let them do their thing. Hey, you come up with a plan. You do the things that you want to do. I'll give input, but you don't have to do what I want you to do verbatim, word for word. You figure out these things and I'll give my input on some of the things on the back end, and go ahead, man, because you'll be the best version of yourself doing it your way. Now, if it doesn't work, then you'll be fired. But I mean, how tough is it if you're Steve Wilks and it's like, well, I'm trying to do everything the way you want me to do. We actually had the third best scoring defense in the league, which would have been the number one scoring defense in the league this year if he had those same numbers. And I get fired, like that is tough. And I'm trying to do it your way to your liking, So I would say if you're going to bring somebody else in, and I'm not saying don't go back to Saleh, but man, it would be nice to bring in a fresh face and bring in a different philosophy. And we talked a little bit about the defensive back coach from the Kansas City Chiefs. I talked about him a little bit, David Merritt, and that would be a different philosophy than what Kyle Shanahan does. Like just the way they run their defense, a lot more man stuff, blitzing, more pressure. Like, it's a little bit more on the back end guys, but heck, let him do his thing. Maybe that changeup will be good for the 49ers. And if you let him do his thing, he'd be the best version of himself. So I think Kyle, I've always said that he's actually the defensive coordinator. Maybe loosen up the reins a little bit and let a defensive guy really do his thing.
Good point in the chat as well for Nick Sorensen. If Nick Sorensen can put his ego aside and kind of take a demotion, if his contract doesn't change, I can't see him getting more money than he's getting right now as a defensive coordinator. If he just shifts over and maybe coaches DBs and coaches the special teams instead, I gotta believe that, you don't have to move your family and you don't have to go searching for a new job. And I'm sure he's going to get paid more staying with the 49ers than as a position coach, maybe somewhere else. So for Nick Sorensen, it might still be the best option, even though probably doesn't feel great to be fired after 1 year, maybe feeling like you didn't get the best chance to develop your own way as a coordinator in the NFL. Because remember, guys, people wanted to fire Robert Saleh when they were a little bit undermanned on defense, and they struggled early in the Kyle Shanahan regime. And then he ended up getting a head coaching job because that thing turned around once he got that pass rush and once he got things stabilized from a personnel perspective, and they figured out and had some growing pains and figured out how they wanted to kind of, start to blend their scheme in with the hardcore cover 3 stuff that they were doing and put in some other elements. So in the chat, they say Sorensen was a terrible special teams coach with the Jaguars too. So maybe he's just not the coordinator for them. I don't know. But I don't know. And I don't know anything about special teams coordinators, Croc. You got a name out there that's not Nick Sorensen that the 49ers should go higher? I know there was that Saints interim coach. He was the special teams coordinator. I have no idea. I wouldn't even know where to begin. And I think that's probably one of the problem for Kyle and John Lynch, but especially Kyle Shanahan, is I don't know if he wants to or knows the right thing to do with special teams, because he's kind of thrown some money at it, brought in free agents, high draft picks on kickers. He's like, that should fix it, right? He's like, no, that hasn't fixed it. Niners special teams have been bad for a long time. They just had to fire a guy 3 years ago and thought they had it fixed with a new coordinator and some new free agents, and that didn't do it either.
Who was the guy for the Las Vegas Raiders back then, the Oakland Raiders, who was a special teams coordinator?
Bisaccia.
Ended up being the interim head coach, and he stayed as a coordinator somewhere else when the Raiders brought in a new regime, but he got paid a lot more money. Like, that's the type of person, I think he may have passed away, RP. But that's the type of coach right there where, heck yeah, man, like, all right, like, I'm just going to have to pay more for a special teams coordinator, but at least let me get the best one. And for whatever reasons, he's great. Special teams coordinators, they take that job very, 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 very seriously. But for whatever reasons that made him better than some of the other guys, you may just have to fork out more cash. Or maybe he's not passed away. Sorry. He's in Green Bay.
Rich Bisaccia, right? That's the guy I think you're thinking of. Yeah, and he's one of the most well thought of special teams coaches in the NFL. I have no idea what to think about special teams coach, so we'll put that on the back burner. But let's talk defensive coordinators. Let's talk specifics. Robert Saleh, as expected, has been interviewed by the San Francisco 49ers. Still has some head coach interviews to finish up as well. Deshea Townsend, a new name added to the list as well. Let's get into that next. This episode of Locked On 49ers brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets to play with, win or lose on that first $5 bet. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same game parlays, and so much more. Of course, tons of NFL football, tons of prop bets for those playoff games. There's NFL draft props as well, off-season NFL props. There's next season bets that you can start to make for futures in the NFL as well. If you don't like the way things have gone this season, tons of ways to bet on the NBA, NHL, every sport out there. You can find all of that action on FanDuel. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com to join today, or download the app and get started with $200 in bonus bets with your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Where you at on Robert Saleh? Is it as easy as saying, look, let's get back to the roots? Robert Saleh, it's too obvious. He's the dude. Bring him in. If he doesn't get a head coach job, and let's run it back to 2021 and maybe get back to the Super Bowl with what we were doing just a few years ago. Or is it not quite that simple for you, Croc?
Josina Anderson made it seem like it's a done deal if he just wants the job. So we'll see what happens there. For me, I think, I try to look at it from Kyle Shanahan's perspective. They had something that worked very well for them. Whatever the relationship was, the dynamic, his relationship with the players, like, it worked. You don't have to guess if it's going to work again. The only thing is if the guys execute for him the way they did in some of those years while he was 49ers defensive coordinator. So I think from that standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Go with someone that you're familiar with. Now, to me, that's not the risky thing. Like, is it high risk, high reward? But you just know more so of what you're getting from them. And if I'm Kyle Shanahan, understanding how hard this person works, how he prepares, knowing that, hey, my guy Fred Warner, Nick Bosa, those guys, they're all in on a guy like him. I think that would give me some incentive to really kind of nudge him to come back this way if I'm Kyle Shanahan.
One of the big things that people don't talk about enough about Robert Saleh, it's not as much even an X's and O's and scheme thing, although clearly, there's a symmetry with Kyle Shanahan and Robert Saleh, and they kind of built this defensive scheme together. But it's the energy that he brings on the sideline. I think that's something the 49ers have lacked the last 2 years after DeMeco Ryans left, because Steve Wilkes started out in the booth. They forced him to go down to the sideline. He wasn't like sweating, and he wasn't ever on TV, like all jacked up, running out and chest bumping guys. Nick Sorensen is definitely sort of a cool customer, looked like a skater dude, calling plays for the 49ers. He almost never said, to be honest with you, I can't remember a coordinator that said less than Nick Sorensen. He never said anything in interviews. I feel like I still don't know the guy at all. He didn't have like a lot of raw personality. And it doesn't have to be necessarily the defensive play caller that's in this role, but Kyle Shanahan's not he's a little bit more excitable than the last two defensive coordinators have been. But having Robert Saleh out there with his sweaty bald head, yelling at guys, all pumped up on the sideline, running the stairs before the game, I think there's just an overall energy that the 49ers lacked from their defensive coaches. And I think that could be just as big as some of the schemes that the 49ers would bring back, because I don't think the scheme's going to change that much from what that. I mean, how much different is it going to be when Kyle Shanahan has forced his last two defensive coordinators to call a similar scheme that they already had?
I think that's the part that, you lead to question. But I think a big part of it, too, is just execution. Maybe there's a way that, Robert Saleh says things a different way than the previous coordinators that resonates more with the players. I talked about it on the Thursday morning episode, how sometimes it's not even about being great for an entire game. And I know everybody wants to go to stats and everything, but I think it's more so about being great or really good when you need to be great or really good. And even with the defense, you look at the Detroit Lions. I mean, they're playing with 15 guys on IR on the defensive line, right, on that side of the ball. They're getting shredded by the 49ers. But when it was time to be good, they were really good or great, right? And they got takeaways and they made stops and they did the things that need to happen. So, what coach is going to get that out of their players when it's not ideal, when it's not perfect, when you've been getting shredded, but you can still motivate your guys to make that play when it's needed, to get up. And then the next week, and I think these are the things that will maybe have Aaron Glenn being interviewed for a head coaching job. All right, we saw the game against the 49ers as a team that's kind of, beat down, maybe not the best version of them, but all right, we figured out a way to win this game and get the stops when needed. Fast forward to the next week, huge game, playing against a divisional foe. You're playing a game that is for the number 1 seed. You can go from the 1st seed to the 5th seed if you lose this game. And that Detroit Lions defense, with everything stacked against them with the injuries, were lights out. Right. So to me, it's really more so about that. Like when you need to stop, when the 49ers defense needed to stop this year, they didn't get it. And that was more the issue than anything else.
I find it interesting. So with Wilkes, with Nick Sorensen, you mentioned David Merritt, they interviewed last offseason, interviewing Deshea Townsend, who's a former NFL cornerback, defensive backs coach for the Lions. He's been with the Cards since 2011, then Mississippi State as a DB coach, then the Titans, then the Giants and the Bears and the Jaguars, and now the Detroit Lions this year as defensive pass game coordinator and defensive backs coach. It really makes me feel old when guys like Deshea Townsend have been coaching already for a dozen years, man. I remember him in college and remember him going into the draft as a player even, man. That's kind of crazy. But is Kyle Shanahan maybe looking in the wrong place for answers on defense? Is it more up front? Because he's been looking in the defensive backfield in recent years. And his two best coordinators were both linebacker coaches. And one was an NFL linebacker himself. And DeMeco Ryans is the front seven where Kyle Shanahan should focus his energy as far as scheme goes, and less about the defensive backfield.
As a former defensive back myself, especially cornerback, I'm willing to admit that the guys that work the front seven, I think they're just a little bit better suited to call defense. Now, that's not to say that you can't learn the front. All right, you can definitely learn it. But I think there's a certain natural feel that guys that play linebacker or play on the defensive line, they just understand how those things work together just a little bit more than guys on the back end. I can rattle off coverages all day that I think will work to this and work to that, but you got to be right in the trenches before anything else. And those guys, they're really good in the trenches. Those guys that have been there, understand it, win the stunt. Okay, the line is doing this, and we need to do this. And again, you can learn those things for sure. But having a natural feel for it, especially when calling plays, I think there's something to that. The guys that were more, kind of groomed at the either second level on that front line.
A couple other names out there. I'm really interested in Lou Anarumo. I think he's a really highly respected coach. I think he was in a rough situation with basically one good player on his defense this year, and he got the axe from the Cincinnati Bengals. He's been a really good defensive coordinator for a really long time. I'd be really interested in him, and he'd be somebody who's the head coach of the defense that Kyle Shanahan has to be more hands off and let him run the scheme. And Jim Schwartz is another name that I see in the chat. It's an interesting. He's been a really good defensive coordinator for a really long time. Some symmetry there with Jim Schwartz and the wide 9 front and Chris Kucerek and all that too. So I could see Jim Schwartz making sense, and I would probably lean toward Anarumo and Schwartz just because I know they've been successful defensive coordinators, and you wouldn't have to be worried about, okay, can they teach while they're learning? Because I think that's been one of the big problems, and you kind of touched on that, Croc. The difference between Saleh running the same scheme as Sorensen or Wilkes is, how do you teach the scheme when you're still learning it yourself? So for Robert Saleh, he could be more of a teacher of it, and he's not trying to figure it out himself on the fly as he's trying to teach it and implement it to his players. So a big
so there's something to that, Peacock, because you got to remember Saleh came in and it was like the Seattle 3 type thing. That was his thing. And Kyle was like, okay, I'm gonna let you do your thing, but it was a defense that he kind of wanted his coordinator to run. And then they adapted to how teams were starting to attack that. And it's like, oh, it's not working as much. We're going to go to too high. Well, the whole time they're going through these different transitions, who's also there in the waiting? DeMeco Ryans. Yeah. So he's there, he's learning. And people kind of skip over this, but DeMeco Ryans, he was a part of the regime when they got here. 2017, he was a 49ers coach with Robert Saleh. So every meeting, every defensive meeting, every conversation that they were all having, like, he was a part of that. So the transition to him, it was a seamless transition because he had been there for years and understood what they were looking for. And that's not the case for Wilkes. Definitely not the case for Sorensen, who had only been there a couple years. So there probably was a lot more trying to learn on the job, which didn't quite work out well.
Really interesting offseason to come. Of course, we're going to have it covered for you every step of the way here on Locked On 49ers. Thank you so much to all the listeners, all the well-wishers out there. Really appreciate you all. It is awesome to be back, and I might have to miss a day or two here over the next couple of weeks, but such an interesting offseason that we will have well covered for you. It's a transitional year, but they might still try to run it back with the same core. And I'm really fascinated to see how Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch are able to navigate this offseason. And of course, there's going to be a lot of talk about the Brock Purdy contract and NFL draft and free agency and a whole lot more right here. Hit that subscribe button, the thumbs up, whether it's on YouTube or wherever you are listening to this podcast. And Croc, once again, I can't thank you enough for filling in for me, especially on short notice over the last couple of weeks here. And Croc and I will be back next time. We'll break down all these playoff games from the wild card weekend right here. Locked On 49ers.